Miss Marple and the Case of the Cursed Cookbook. Welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm Alaya, your host, and it warms my heart to know you're here with us tonight. Tell me, what is it that draws you to these cozy mysteries? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our daily stories. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The Cookbook at the Auction. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of the St. Mary Parish Hall, casting long rectangles of golden light across the assembled chairs, and the small stage where Mr. Pithrick, the auctioneer, was arranging his papers with fussy precision. Miss Jane Marple sat in the third row, her knitting bag resting on her lap, her bright blue eyes taking in the scene with the same quiet attention she might give to observing sparrows in her garden. The annual charity auction was always well attended. It was one of those village occasions that served multiple purposes: raising funds for the church roof, providing an afternoon's entertainment, and offering ample opportunity for the sort of social observation that Miss Marple found endlessly instructive. "Such a good turnout this year," remarked Mrs. Bantry, settling into the chair beside her. "I do hope someone bids on that hideous vase donated. I've been trying to rid myself of it for 3 years." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I'm sure it will find an appreciative home, my dear. One person's burden is often another's treasure." The hall was filling steadily. Miss Marple recognized most of the faces. There was Colonel Melchett and his wife making their way to the front row with the assurance of people who expected deference. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, was arranging tea things on a side table, her movements quick and nervous. And there, just entering through the main door, was Mrs. Millicent Harrow, a handsome woman in her late 40s, with an expression of eager anticipation. "That's Millicent Harrow," Mrs. Bantry whispered. Though Miss Marple had already identified her, she's become quite the enthusiast for old recipes. Won the Women's Guild baking competition 3 years running. "How remarkable," Miss Marple murmured. She noticed Mr. Alfred Harrow trailing behind his wife, a thin man with stooped shoulders and the distracted air of someone who would rather be elsewhere. His face wore the there-signed expression of a husband, long accustomed to attending events that held no interest for him. The auction began with the usual assortment of items: a set of bone china teacups, a brass coal scuttle, several watercolors of dubious merit. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she worked on a pale blue jumper for her great-nephew, but her attention never wavered from the room. It was when Mr. Pithrick held up a leather-bound volume that the atmosphere shifted perceptibly. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, we have something rather special. An 18th century cookbook believed to have belonged to the household of Lady Greaves of Greaves Manor." He paused for effect, adjusting his spectacles. "Some of you may recall the rather unfortunate history associated with this volume." A ripple of interest moved through the audience. Miss Marple observed Mrs. Harrow leaning forward, her eyes bright with interest. "The Cursed Cookbook," someone whispered behind Miss Marple. Mr. Pithrick smiled indulgently. Now, we are modern people. We don't put stock in such superstitions." Nevertheless, the story goes that Lady Greaves, shortly after acquiring this cookbook, died most unexpectedly at her own dinner table. Some blame the recipes, others blame darker forces, but I'm sure we all agree it's merely a coincidence and a piece of fascinating local history. Miss Marple noted that Mrs. Clement had crossed herself discreetly, a gesture that seemed quite unconscious. Vicar's wife was not a superstitious woman as a rule, which made the gesture all the more interesting. "The book has been generously donated by Mrs. Ellsworth Ray," Mr. Pithrick continued. Miss Marple's gaze found Mrs. Ray seated near the back of the hall. She was a widow somewhat older than Mrs. Harrow, with sharp features and the sort of rigid posture that suggested a person who took pride in maintaining standards. At the mention of her name, Mrs. Ray inclined her head slightly, but her expression remained carefully neutral. I simply couldn't keep such a thing in my kitchen any longer, Mrs. Ray said, her voice carrying clearly. Call me foolish, but one does feel uneasy about such objects. Shall we start the bidding at 5 years? Mr. Petherick suggested. Mrs. Harrow's hand shot up immediately. $5.07, came a voice from the side. It was Mr. Trimble, the antiques dealer from the next village. 10, Mrs. Harrow said firmly. The bidding continued rising in increments. Miss Marple watched Alfred Harrow's face grow, progressively more strained. When his wife bid 15s, he leaned toward her and whispered something urgent. Mrs. Harrow shook her head impatiently, not taking her eyes from the auctioneer. 20, Mrs. Harrow declared, and there was a finality in her tone that discouraged further competition. 20 going once, going twice. Mr. Petherick's gavel fell. Sold to Mrs. Harrow. A smattering of applause followed, mixed with nervous laughter. Mrs. Harrow rose with obvious satisfaction and made her way to the front to claim her prize. As she passed Miss Marple's row, her face was flushed with triumph. Such nonsense about curses, she said to no one in particular. I shall make the most wonderful dishes from these old recipes. Alfred Harrow had not moved from his seat. His expression, Miss Marple thought, was remarkably similar to that of Mr. Agar, the grocer's assistant, who had once watched his employer order 3 times the usual stock of tinned sardines just before a rail strike cut off all deliveries. It was the look of a man witnessing a decision he knew to be unwise but was powerless to prevent. During the tea interval that followed, Miss Marple found herself near the table where Mrs. Harrow was examining her purchase. The cookbook's worn leather binding dark against the white cloth. Such beautiful handwriting, Mrs. Harrow was saying to Mrs. Clement. And look at these recipes. Pudding a la rosewater, marchpane delights, lamb and aspic. I simply must try them all. I do hope you'll be careful, Mrs. Clement said softly. One hears such stories. Mrs. Harrow laughed, a bright, confident sound. My dear Mrs. Clement, I've been cooking for 30 years. I hardly think an old book poses any danger. Of course not, Mrs. Clement agreed, but her fingers found the small cross at her throat. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Bantry and moved to a quieter corner of the hall. From this vantage point, she could observe the small dramas unfolding. Mrs. Ray stood alone by the window, watching Mrs. Harrow with an expression that was difficult to read, but which reminded Miss Marple of her gardener's cat observing a particularly plump pigeon. Alfred Harrow had finally approached his wife, and their conversation, though conducted in low tones, appeared strained. Mrs. Harrow gestured dismissively with one hand before turning away to speak with the vicar. 20 for an old cookbook, Mrs. Bantry said, rejoining Miss Marple. I call that excessive. People will pay a great deal for their enthusiasms, Miss Marple replied mildly. Though I confess, I've always found it curious how eager we are to possess things others have deemed unlucky. Perhaps it's a way of proving ourselves superior to superstition. Or perhaps simply foolish, Mrs. Bantry suggested. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. That remains to be seen, dear. That remains to be seen. As the afternoon drew to a close and the villagers began to depart, Miss Marple gathered her knitting bag and took one last look around the hall. Mrs. Harrow was clutching her cookbook like a prize, already planning her culinary adventures. Mrs. Ray had slipped out quietly without speaking to anyone, and Alfred Harrow walked several paces behind his wife, his shoulders more stooped than ever. It was, Miss Marple reflected as she stepped out into the late afternoon sunshine, a perfectly ordinary village auction. And yet something in the air felt unsettled, like the moment before a storm when the birds fall silent and the leaves turn their pale undersides to the sky. She would wait and see what developed. In her experience, when people laughed too loudly at superstitions, it often meant they were trying to convince themselves of something they didn't quite believe. Chapter 2. A Recipe for Disaster. 3 days passed in the quiet manner typical of St. Mary Mead in early autumn. Miss Marple tended her garden, noting with satisfaction that the Michaelmas daisies were particularly fine this year, and observed the comings and goings of the village with her usual gentle attention. On Thursday afternoon, she received an unexpected invitation. Young Dora Bennet, who worked as kitchen maid for the Harrows, arrived at Miss Marple's gate with a note written in Mrs. Harrow's enthusiastic hand. "Mrs. Harrow requests the pleasure of your company at the Women's Guild luncheon tomorrow," Dora recited, bobbing a nervous curtsy. "She's made something special from the old cookbook, miss, and wants everyone to taste it." Miss Marple accepted the note with a smile. "How kind of Mrs. Harrow. And how are you getting on in your position, Dora? Mrs. Harrow keeps you busy, I imagine." The girl's face brightened momentarily, then clouded. "Oh, yes, miss, very busy lately. Mrs. Harrow's been in the kitchen morning and night with that book. She's that determined to prove it's all nonsense about curses and such." "I see," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "And what do you think about it?" Dora glanced over her shoulder, though there was no one else in sight. "I think some things are best left alone, miss, but I'm only the kitchen maid, so nobody asks my opinion." After the girl had gone, Miss Marple sat in her drawing room and considered the invitation. It was rather like Mrs. Harrow to make a public display of her triumph. There was something almost defiant in the gesture, as though she were challenging the very notion of the curse. The Women's Guild luncheon was held in the parish hall, the same room that had hosted the auction. Miss Marple arrived punctually at 12, finding the tables already laid with the parish's best china. Mrs. Bantry had secured them seats near the center, affording an excellent view of the proceedings. "Millicent has been insufferable," Mrs. Bantry whispered as Miss Marple settled herself. "She's told everyone who would listen about her plans for this luncheon. Apparently, she's preparing a plum pudding from Lady Greves's own recipe in September." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows slightly. "How unusual." "That's what I said. But Millicent insists that truly accomplished cooks don't restrict themselves to seasons." The room filled gradually. Miss Marple noted the attendance with interest. Mrs. Clement was there, of course, as befitted the vicar's wife. Colonel Melchett's wife had come, accompanied by her sister, and there, taking a seat at the far table, was Mrs. Elizabeth Ray, her face composed, but her eyes watchful. Mrs. Harrow herself was in high spirits, moving from table to table with the manner of a hostess at a grand occasion. Rather than a simple village luncheon, she wore a new dress in burgundy silk that rustled impressively. "I followed Lady Greves's instructions precisely," she announced to the room at large. "Every measurement exact, every ingredient authentic. You'll find it quite superior to modern recipes which have become sadly simplified." The first courses were served, a clear soup followed by cold chicken and salad. Miss Marple ate sparingly, watching the dynamics of the room. Mrs. Ray, she noticed, had barely touched her food. Alfred Harrow, who had been pressed into service as an unofficial attendant, moved about with a tray of water glasses, his face drawn and weary. When he passed their table, Miss Marple observed that his hands trembled slightly, causing the glasses to clink against one another. "Poor Mr. Harrow looks quite exhausted," she remarked to Mrs. Bantry. "Millicent had him up until all hours helping with preparations," Mrs. Bantry replied. "He told Colonel Melchett that his wife barely slept. She was so excited about this wretched pudding." At last, with considerable ceremony, Mrs. Harrow herself carried in the pudding. It was a magnificent creation, dark and rich, studded with fruits and emanating a complex aroma of spices and brandy. A murmur of appreciation ran through the assembled ladies. "Lady Greaves served this at Christmas in 1748, Mrs. Harrow announced proudly. The recipe calls for 17 ingredients, including almonds, which give it that distinctive flavor. Miss Marple's attention sharpened at the mention of almonds, though she could not have said precisely why. Mrs. Harrow cut the first slice with a flourish and served herself a modest portion. "I simply must taste it before anyone else," she said with a laugh. A cook's privilege, after all. She took a small bite, chewing thoughtfully. For a moment her expression remained animated, almost triumphant. Then quite suddenly something changed. Her eyes widened. The color drained from her face with startling rapidity. Millicent! Mrs. Bantry half rose from her chair. Mrs. Harrow's hand went to her throat. She tried to speak, but no words came. The plate slipped from her other hand, shattering on the floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. She swayed, reached for the back of a chair, missed it, and collapsed. The room erupted into chaos. Someone screamed. Chairs scraped back as people rushed forward or pressed themselves against the walls. Miss Marple remained seated, her eyes moving quickly across the scene, noting details with the automatic precision of long habit. Alfred Harrow was the first to reach his wife, falling to his knees beside her. "Millie! Millie! Can you hear me?" Mrs. Clement had run to fetch Dr. Haddock, who by good fortune had been visiting the vicarage next door. He arrived within minutes, his medical bag in hand, and knelt beside Mrs. Harrow's prone form. The doctor worked quickly, checking pulse and breathing, opening his bag to retrieve various instruments. But even from her position, several feet away, Miss Marple could see from his expression that his efforts were futile. After what seemed an eternity, but was perhaps only 5 minutes, Dr. Haddock sat back on his heels and shook his head slowly. "I'm very sorry," he said quietly. "She's gone." Alfred Harrow made a sound that was not quite a sob, not quite a gasp. He remained kneeling beside his wife's body, one hand gripping hers with terrible intensity. But how? Someone whispered. "What happened?" Dr. Haddock's face was grave. "I cannot say with certainty, not without a proper examination, but the symptoms—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "They suggest severe poisoning of some kind, possibly something in the food." "The pudding," Mrs. Ray's voice cut through the shocked murmurs. "The cursed pudding. Now," Dr. Haddock said firmly. "Let's not jump to conclusions. This could be any number of things. Food poisoning, perhaps from spoiled ingredients. But Miss Marple, watching the scene with her sharp, bright eyes, thought of the careful way Mrs. Harrow had described following the recipe exactly, and the mention of almonds, and the particular shade of gray that had overtaken the poor woman's face. She thought, too, of Alfred Harrow's trembling hands and sleepless nights, and of Mrs. Ray's watchful expression at the back of the room. "Such a tragedy," Mrs. Bantry murmured beside her, gripping Miss Marple's arm. "And at a church luncheon, of all places." Miss Marple patted her friend's hand absently. "Yes, dear. Quite dreadful." But in her mind she was already beginning to knit together the small observations of the past few days, the way she might work at a complicated pattern, following each thread to see where it led. A curse, the villagers would say. But Miss Marple had lived too long and seen too much to believe in curses. Murder, she thought, required no supernatural explanation, only human nature, which was quite dark enough on its own. Chapter 3. The Pudding That Killed. The police arrived within the hour in the person of Inspector Slack from the county constabulary, accompanied by Constable Polk from the village. Inspector? Slack was a heavy-set man with a florid complexion and a manner that suggested he found rural investigations beneath his capabilities. "Now then," he said, surveying the parish hall with barely concealed irritation. "I understand we have a case of food poisoning? Unfortunate, but hardly a matter for criminal investigation." Dr. Haddock, who had remained with the body, straightened from his examination. "I wouldn't be quite so certain, Inspector. The symptoms were extremely acute. Mrs. Harrow collapsed within moments of consuming the pudding." People have violent reactions to spoiled food all the time, Inspector Slack said dismissively. Bad eggs, rancid butter, that sort of thing. Nevertheless, Dr. Haddock said with professional firmness, I've arranged for the pudding to be analyzed until we know precisely what caused Mrs. Harrow's death. I think it wise to treat this as suspicious. Miss Marple, who had been sitting quietly while the other ladies were ushered to the far end of the hall, observed this exchange with interest. Inspector Slack was the sort of man who preferred simple explanations, she had noticed. It saved time and effort and allowed him to return to more important matters in the city. The pudding, what remained of it, sat on the serving table like an exhibit in a museum. Inspector Slack poked at it with a fork, sniffed it, and shrugged. Smells like pudding to me, he announced. Nevertheless, it will be analyzed, Dr. Haddock repeated, his tone suggesting he would brook no argument on this point. The following morning, Miss Marple was deadheading roses in her front garden when Dr. Haddock's car pulled up at her gate. He emerged looking tired and troubled. Might I have a word, Miss Marple? He asked without preamble. She led him into her sitting room and rang for tea. Dr. Haddock settled into a chair with a heavy sigh. The analysis came back from the laboratory early this morning, he said. Traces of cyanide in the pudding, specifically in the form of bitter almonds. Quite a substantial amount, actually. Miss Marple poured tea with a steady hand, though her expression grew grave. I see. Then it was not an accident. It would appear not. The concentration was far too high to be naturally occurring. Someone added it deliberately. He accepted the teacup gratefully. Inspector Slack is treating it as murder now, though he's fixated on the husband, of course. Always the husband in his experience. Mr. Alfred Harrow, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. Yes, I can see why the inspector might think so. You saw him at the luncheon? He seemed genuinely devastated. Oh, I don't doubt his distress was real, Miss Marple said gently. But grief and guilt are not mutually exclusive, Doctor. I remember a gardener we once employed who wept terribly when his employer's prize roses died, even though he himself had applied the wrong fertilizer through carelessness. Dr. Haddock looked at her shrewdly. You think Harrow did it? I think, Miss Marple said, choosing her words with care, that Mr. Harrow had both opportunity and means. Mrs. Bantry mentioned he was helping his wife with preparations the evening before the luncheon, and I noticed something at the auction that has stayed with me. What was that? When I complimented Mr. Harrow on his garden last summer, he spoke at some length about his battles with various pests. He was particularly proud of his success with greenfly and slugs. He mentioned keeping a small shed with various treatments, including insecticides that might contain cyanide. Dr. Haddock finished grimly. Precisely. It would not have been difficult for him to access such materials. Miss Marple paused to sip her tea. And yet, there's something that doesn't quite fit. When Mrs. Harrow collapsed, Mr. Harrow's reaction was immediate and unguarded. He called her Millie, which I had not heard him use before. It suggested genuine affection, not merely the shock of witnessing a death one has caused. Dr. Haddock frowned. People can be excellent actors when their lives depend on it. Indeed, they can, but it requires rather more self-possession than Mr. Harrow appeared to possess. Miss Marple set down her cup with a soft click. Tell me, Doctor, when exactly would the cyanide have been added to the pudding? Difficult to say precisely, but given how it was distributed throughout, I'd say it must have been mixed in before the final cooking, or perhaps while the pudding was still warm and could absorb liquid, which means it could have been added the night before during preparation, or even the morning of the luncheon before it was transported to the hall. Theoretically, yes, though the pudding was kept in the Harrows' kitchen until Mrs. Harrow herself carried it to the parish hall. Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, looking out at her garden. Mrs. Harrow was quite particular about that pudding, wasn't she? She announced to the entire room that she would taste it first. A fatal decision, as it turned out. Or perhaps, Miss Marple said slowly, the decision someone was counting on her making. Doctor, you said the cyanide was in the form of bitter almonds. Would that not impart a distinctive taste? One would think so, yes, though the pudding itself contained almonds as part of the original recipe, which might have masked it somewhat. How convenient, Miss Marple murmured. She turned back to face him. I wonder if you might do me a small favor, Doctor. If I can? Would you be able to discover whether Mrs. Harrow's kitchen was accessible to anyone besides the family? I'm thinking particularly of the evening before the luncheon and the morning of it. Dr. Haddock looked puzzled. You think someone else might have tampered with the pudding? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that a man who has lived with his wife for many years and who helps her carry a heavy mixing bowl is unlikely to poison that same bowl while his kitchen maid is present in the house. It would be remarkably foolish, but Harrow had the means and opportunity. Yes, he did. Which is precisely what troubles me. She returned to her chair and picked up her knitting, her needles beginning their steady rhythm. In my experience, Doctor, when a solution appears too obvious, it often means we are meant to see it, like a conjurer's trick, where the flashy gesture with one hand conceals what the other hand is truly doing. Dr. Haddock rose to leave, looking thoughtful. I'll make some inquiries about the household arrangements. Quietly, of course. And Dr. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. You might also inquire about Mrs. Harrow's recent activities, who she saw, what she discussed, whether she had any disagreements with anyone. Small village quarrels can fester into something quite ugly given time and the right circumstances. After he had gone, Miss Marple sat for a long while, her knitting forgotten in her lap. She thought of Alfred Harrow's grief, which had seemed genuine. She thought of the bitter almond smell that young Dora had mentioned and wondered if the girl had noticed it before or after the luncheon. And she thought of Mrs. Ray's voice cutting through the chaos. The cursed pudding. It had been, Miss Marple reflected, a remarkably apt moment to remind everyone of the curse, almost as though someone had been waiting for precisely such an opportunity. Outside her window, the shadows lengthened across the garden. In St. Mary Mead, the shops were closing for the evening, and people were speaking in hushed tones about the tragedy at the parish hall. But Miss Marple's mind was already moving beyond the obvious, following threads that others might overlook, searching for the pattern beneath the surface. Someone had wanted Millicent Harrow dead, and someone had been clever enough to make it look like either an accident or a husband's crime. The question was, who stood to gain from both outcomes? Chapter 4. The Widow's Secret Ingredient. Afternoon following Dr. Haddock's visit found Miss Marple taking tea with Mrs. Bantry at the latter's comfortable home. The drawing room was bright with autumn sunshine, but the conversation had taken a decidedly somber turn. The whole village is talking about nothing else, Mrs. Bantry said, pouring from her best china pot. Half of them are convinced it's the curse come true, and the other half are equally certain that poor Alfred poisoned his wife. Inspector Slack has been questioning him for hours, I'm told. Has he indeed? Miss Marple accepted her cup with a thoughtful expression. And what does the village say about Mr. Harrow's character? Oh, everyone agrees he's a harmless sort, rather dominated by Millicent, if truth be told. She had very decided opinions about everything. Mrs. Bantry paused, then lowered her voice. Though I shouldn't speak ill of the dead, there were times when Millicent could be rather difficult. In what way? Mrs. Bantry settled back in her chair, clearly warming to her subject. Well, there was that unfortunate business with the baking competition last spring. Millicent won, of course, but there was considerable feeling that Elizabeth Ray should have taken first prize. Miss Marple's needles clicked gently as she continued with her knitting. Mrs. Ray, yes, I've been thinking about her rather a lot lately. Have you? I suppose it is curious that she donated the cookbook considering what happened. Tell me about this baking competition, Miss Marple said. I was visiting my nephew Raymond in London at the time. I believe it was quite the scandal in a small way. Elizabeth Ray had developed a recipe for what she called the Queen's Sponge. Absolutely divine, apparently. Light as air with just a hint of lemon. She'd been perfecting it for months. Then, at the competition, Millicent Harrow presented an almost identical cake. Same texture, same subtle flavor. Elizabeth was absolutely furious. She accused Mrs. Harrow of copying her recipe. More than that, she claimed Millicent had somehow obtained her written recipe card. There was quite a scene at the judging table. Elizabeth said some rather harsh things, and Mrs. Harrow won nonetheless. The judges felt they couldn't disqualify her based on mere suspicion. Millicent insisted she developed her own recipe independently, though she did seem rather smug about the whole affair. Mrs. Bantry sipped her tea. Elizabeth barely spoke to her afterward. In fact, I don't believe they'd exchanged a civil word since then. Miss Marple absorbed this information with the same quiet attention she gave to all village gossip, recognizing it as the valuable data it truly was. And yet Mrs. Ray attended the luncheon where the pudding was served. She did, didn't she? I thought that rather odd at the time, given the animosity between them. But perhaps she wanted to see if Millicent's cooking from the old book would be a disaster. Mrs. Bantry frowned. That sounds terrible, doesn't it? But you know how these things are in a village. I know very well, Miss Marple said gently. She set down her knitting and looked directly at her friend. Tell me, what do you know about Mrs. Ray donating the cookbook to the auction? Only what she said publicly, that she couldn't bear to keep such a cursed object in her kitchen. Though between you and me, I've always thought Elizabeth enjoyed the drama of it all. She does like to be at the center of things. Did she mention how she came to possess the cookbook? Mrs. Bantry considered this. I believe it was part of an estate sale she attended some months ago. She collects old kitchen implements and recipe books. Has quite a collection, actually. How interesting, Miss Marple murmured. So she kept the cookbook for some time before deciding to donate it. Several months, I should think. The auction was only 3 weeks ago. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, but her mind was clearly elsewhere. I wonder if I might call on Mrs. Ray tomorrow. It would be only neighborly to express my condolences, given that the cookbook came from her household. I'm sure she'd receive you, Mrs. Bantry said, though her tone suggested some doubt. Elizabeth can be rather prickly, but she does observe the proprieties. The following morning, Miss Marple presented herself at Mrs. Ray's cottage, a neat establishment on the edge of the village. The garden was precisely maintained, with not a weed visible among the flower beds. It spoke, Miss Marple thought, of a woman who liked control and order. Mrs. Ray herself answered the door, dressed in black, though she'd not been particularly close to the deceased. Her sharp features were composed, but Heary's held a watchful quality that reminded Miss Marple of a cat uncertain whether to flee or attack. Miss Marple, this is unexpected. I hope I'm not intruding, Mrs. Ray. I wanted to express my sympathy for what must be a difficult time for you. Mrs. Ray's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise. For me, I was hardly a friend of Millicent Harrow's. No, but the cookbook came from your collection. You must feel some responsibility, however unjustified. After a moment's hesitation, Mrs. Ray stepped back to allow Miss Marple entry. The sitting room was filled with shelves displaying various antique kitchen items, copper molds, ceramic jelly dishes, and several old cookbooks. I assure you, Miss Marple, I feel no responsibility whatsoever, Mrs. Ray said, settling into a high-backed chair. What happened to Millicent Harrow was either a tragic accident or the result of someone's deliberate action. Neither has anything to do with a 300-year-old book. Of course not, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. Though I understand there was some difficulty between you and Mrs. Harrow over a recipe. The Queen's Sponge, I believe it was called. Mrs. Ray's face hardened. Millicent Harrow was a thief. She stole my recipe and passed it off as her own work. That must have been very distressing. Distressing. It was infuriating. I'd spent months perfecting that recipe, and she simply helped herself to it as if she had every right. Mrs. Ray's hands gripped the arms of her chair. She won first prize with my work, my creativity, and when I confronted her, she had the audacity to deny it. Could she perhaps have developed something similar independently? Impossible. The measurements were identical, down to the quarter teaspoon of lemon zest. No, she stole it. Probably from my kitchen. When she visited last autumn for the harvest supper, Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. Such behavior must make one feel quite powerless. Exactly. So, Mrs. Ray seemed to realize she had been speaking with considerable heat and moderated her tone. Not that I wished her any harm, you understand, but I cannot pretend to mourn her. And the cookbook. Why did you decide to part with it? Mrs. Ray's expression became guarded. I told everyone at the auction. The stories about the curse made me uncomfortable. But you kept it for several months after purchasing it. I was uncertain. It's a valuable piece historically speaking, but in the end I decided it was better to let it go. She met Miss Marple's gaze directly. I certainly never imagined Millicent Harrow would be fool enough to buy it and actually cook from it. No, Miss Marple said softly. I don't suppose you did. She took her leave shortly afterward, walking slowly back through the village. The pieces were beginning to fit together, though the picture they formed was still incomplete. Mrs. Ray had both motive and knowledge. She had possessed the cookbook long enough to study it thoroughly, and she had reason to wish Millicent Harrow ill. But had her anger at a stolen recipe truly been sufficient to drive her to murder? Miss Marple thought of the careful way Mrs. Ray maintained her garden, not a blade of grass out of place. She thought of the controlled fury in the woman's voice when speaking of the recipe theft. Some people, Miss Marple reflected, could not bear to lose. And when they did lose, they would go to considerable lengths to even the score. The question was, how far would Mrs. Ray go? Chapter 5. The kitchen maid's whisper. Miss Marple had learned long ago that servants saw and heard far more than their employers ever imagined. They moved through households like ghosts, present but unnoticed, privy to conversations and scenes that would never unfold before company. And so it was that 2 days after her visit to Mrs. Ray, she found herself calling at the Harrow residence with a basket of preserves and a sympathetic expression. The house had a shuttered, mournful quality. The curtains were drawn in the front windows, and the garden, usually so meticulously maintained, showed signs of neglect. Miss Marple was not surprised when young Dora answered the door, her eyes red-rimmed and her cap slightly askew. "Oh, Miss Marple," the girl said, her voice catching. "Mr. Harrow isn't receiving visitors, I'm afraid." "I quite understand, dear. I've brought some blackberry preserves for the household. I thought they might be welcome during this difficult time." Miss Marple held out the basket. "And I wondered how you were managing. It must be terribly hard for you." The simple kindness seemed to undo what remained of Dora's composure. Her face crumpled and tears spilled down her cheeks. "Oh, miss, it's been awful. The police have been here every day asking questions, and Mr. Harrow just sits in his study and won't eat properly. I don't know what to do. Perhaps you might spare a moment to show me to the kitchen," Miss Marple suggested gently. "I'd like to put these preserves away properly, and I'm sure you could use a cup of tea." Dora led her through the house to the kitchen, a large, well-appointed room that still bore traces of Mrs. Harrow's recent activity. Miss Marple noted the cookbook lying on the counter. its pages still marked with scraps of paper. A mixing bowl sat in the sink, not yet washed. "You mustn't let these things accumulate, dear," Miss Marple said, filling the kettle. "Work can be a comfort at times like these." While the water boiled, she moved about the kitchen with the ease of someone long accustomed to domestic spaces. Her sharp eyes took in everything: the spice rack with its neat labels, the pantry door standing slightly ajar, the faint discoloration on the counter, where something had been spilled and hastily wiped. "Tell me, Dora," she said as she prepared the tea, "were you here the evening before the luncheon, when Mrs. Harrow was preparing the pudding?" Dora nodded, accepting the cup gratefully. "Yes, miss. Mrs. Harrow had me helping all afternoon. There was so much to do." "I'm sure there was. And did she work late into the evening?" "Until past 9 o'clock, miss. She was that determined everything should be perfect." Mr. Harrow helped carry the mixing bowl down from the high shelf. "It's very heavy, you see, the big stoneware one. How helpful of him." "And after Mrs. Harrow finished her preparations, did she go straight to bed?" Dora's hands trembled slightly around her teacup. "She did, miss. She was exhausted. Said she'd been on her feet all day. Told me to lock up and go to my room." "And did you?" There was a long pause. Dora stared into her tea, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I meant to, miss, but I'd forgotten to put out the milk bottles, and when I came back from doing that, I heard something." Miss Marple sat down across from the girl, her expression encouraging but not pressing. "What did you hear, dear?" "Someone was in the kitchen. I could hear them moving about." Dora's voice dropped even lower. "I heard a drawer open, and then the sound of a spoon against the mixing bowl. I thought it must be Mrs. Harrow come back down to check something. She did that sometimes. Couldn't rest until she was satisfied everything was just right." "But you didn't come in to see?" "No, miss. I went to my room. I didn't want Mrs. Harrow to think I was spying on her." Dora's eyes filled with fresh tears. "But the next morning, when I came down early to start the breakfast, there was a smell in the kitchen." "What sort of smell?" "Sweet, but wrong somehow, like almonds, but sharper. It was lingering in the pantry." She gestured toward the small room off the kitchen. "I opened the window to air it out, thinking maybe something had spoiled." Miss Marple rose and moved to the pantry. It was a neat, orderly space with shelves of preserved goods and dry ingredients. But there, on the floor in the corner, was a small brown bottle pushed back as though someone had hoped it would go unnoticed. "Dora, when did you last clean this pantry thoroughly?" "2 days before the luncheon, miss. Mrs. Harrow was very particular about keeping things tidy." Miss Marple bent down, careful not to touch the bottle, and examined it closely. The label was partially torn, but she could make out the words "Bitter Almond" in faded script. "This wasn't here when you cleaned." "No." "Miss, I'm certain of it." Miss Marple straightened, her mind working rapidly. "Dora, I want you to think very carefully. When you heard someone in the kitchen that night, are you absolutely certain it was Mrs. Harrow?" The girl's face went pale. I thought it was, but I didn't actually see anyone. The kitchen door was closed, and I was in the hallway." "Could it have been Mr. Harrow?" "I don't think so, miss. He'd gone up to bed before Mrs. Harrow. I heard him on the stairs while I was still tidying the dining room." "Then, who else has access to this house?" Dora bit her lip. "Well, Mrs. Harrow gave a spare key to Mrs. Ray last year when she went to visit her sister in Bath. In case of emergencies," she said, "but I don't know if she ever got it back." Miss Marple felt a small thrill of confirmation, though she kept their expression carefully neutral. "I see. And did Mrs. Ray visit at all in the days before the luncheon?" "Not that I saw, miss, though—" Dora hesitated. "Yes. The morning of the luncheon, there was a parcel left on the back doorstep, wrapped in brown paper and string. Mrs. Harrow seemed surprised by it, but she took it into the kitchen and closed the door." When she came out again, she told me to deliver something to Mrs. Ray's house. What was it you delivered? I don't know, miss. It was wrapped up tight, but it was about the size and weight of a pudding basin. Miss Marple returned to her seat, her expression thoughtful. Dora, you haven't mentioned any of this to the police, have you? The girl shook her head miserably. I didn't think it mattered, miss. And I was afraid they'd think I should have done something. Should have checked who was in the kitchen that night. You mustn't blame yourself, dear. You couldn't have known what was happening. Miss Marple patted the girl's hand gently. But I think it would be wise to mention these things to Inspector Slack, or better yet, to Dr. Haddock. He'll make sure the information reaches the right people. After she left the Harrow house, Miss Marple walked slowly through the village, her mind arranging and rearranging the pieces of the puzzle. The picture was becoming clearer, though several elements still eluded her. Someone had been in the Harrow kitchen late that night. Someone who had access to the house and knowledge of where the pudding was stored. Someone who had left behind a bottle of bitter almond essence. And someone had sent Mrs. Harrow a mysterious parcel the very morning of the luncheon. Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Ray's controlled fury, her meticulous garden, a collection of old recipe books. She thought of the careful way a clever person might plan to harm an enemy, while ensuring the blame fell elsewhere. The curse, she reflected, had been a useful distraction, but the real poison had come from a far more mundane source. Human nature, as always, was the darkest mystery of all. Chapter 6. A Missing Page. Miss Marple had often observed that evidence, like truth, had a way of revealing itself to those patient enough to look properly. It was with this philosophy in mind that she made her way to the parish hall 3 days after her conversation with Dora, requesting permission from Mrs. Clement to examine the cookbook that had caused such tragedy. I'm not entirely sure where it's got to, Mrs. Clement said, wringing her hands anxiously. After the inquest, Inspector Slack said we could have it back, but nobody quite wanted to touch it. I believe the vicar put it somewhere safe. The vicar was summoned, and after some searching, the cookbook was located in a locked drawer in his study, wrapped in clean muslin, as though it might contaminate anything it touched. Take it. Miss Marple, please, the vicar said with evident relief. I confess the sight of it distresses my wife considerably. Perhaps you might find it a proper home, somewhere it can do no further harm. Miss Marple accepted the volume carefully. It was smaller than she had remembered, bound in dark leather that had cracked with age. The pages were yellowed, but still legible, filled with recipes written in the elaborate script of another century. She carried it home and settled in her sitting room with good light from the window. For an hour she read through the recipes methodically, noting the careful instructions for dishes long out of fashion, syllabubs and junkets, ragouts and fricassees. It was when she reached the section on puddings that she found what she was looking for. The recipe for pudding à la rosewater was there, written in the same flowing hand as the rest of the book. But halfway through the instructions, the page had been torn, leaving a ragged edge where the remainder should have been. Miss Marple examined the tear closely. It was relatively fresh, the paper at the edge still crisp rather than softened with age. Someone had removed this page recently, and with some haste, judging by the irregular tear. She turned her attention to the wastebasket beside the small writing desk, where the cookbook had presumably been examined. Mrs. Clement, bless her, was not the most diligent of housekeepers. The basket had not been emptied since the tragedy. Beneath several discarded envelopes and a notice about the flower rhoda, Miss Marple found the missing page, crumpled but intact. She smoothed it carefully on her lap. The original recipe continued in the same formal script, calling for rosewater, cream, and ground almonds. But in the margins, written in modern ink with a hurried hand, were additional notations. Half teaspoon only, one note read, with an arrow pointing to the almond measurement. Another note, written in the same hand, said simply, "Too much bitter." Miss Marple sat very still, her mind working through the implications. Someone had been experimenting with this recipe, adjusting the measurements, and that someone had written these notes recently enough that the ink had not yet faded. She fetched her magnifying glass and examined the handwriting more closely. It was a woman's hand, educated but hurried, the letters slanting forward with impatience. Not the careful, rounded script of Mrs. Harrow, who had once shown Miss Marple her recipe cards, each one a model of neat penmanship. No, this was a different hand entirely, one that Miss Marple suspected. She might recognize if she could find a sample for comparison. That afternoon she called upon Mrs. Bantry with a small request. "I wonder if you might still have that note Mrs. Ray sent round about the garden party last month, the one where she offered to bring her rose." "Cordial." Mrs. Bantry looked puzzled but obliging. "I believe I kept it somewhere. She does write the most elaborate notes for the simplest things." After some searching through a drawer, she produced a card written in a flowing, forward-slanting hand. "Here it is. Why do you ask?" Miss Marple compared it carefully with the notations on the cookbook page she had brought with her. The slant was identical, as was the particular way the writer formed her capital letters, with an extra flourish on the downstroke. "Just satisfying my curiosity." "Dear," Miss Marple said, though her eyes held a gleam of satisfaction. That evening, Dr. Haddock called at the cottage, his expression grave. "I've spoken with young Dora, as you suggested," he said, accepting a glass of sherry. "She told me about the bottle in the pantry and the mysterious parcel. I've passed the information along to Inspector Slack, though I'm not certain he appreciated the significance." "Inspector Slack rarely appreciates anything that doesn't fit his preconceived notions," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Did Dora mention anything else?" "She said the parcel that arrived the morning of the luncheon smelled faintly of cinnamon, and something else she couldn't quite place. She thought perhaps it was a gift of baked goods from a friend." "How interesting," Miss Marple said. She retrieved the cookbook page and showed it to him. "What do you make of this, Doctor?" He studied the notations carefully. "Someone was adjusting the recipe, testing different amounts?" He looked up sharply. "This is Mrs. Ray's handwriting, isn't it?" "I believe so." "Yes," which suggests she had the cookbook in her possession long enough to study it thoroughly and make notes. "Long enough, perhaps, to form a plan." Dr. Haddock sat down his glass with a sharp click. "You think she poisoned the pudding before Mrs. Harrow ever cooked it?" "I think someone very clever realized that an old recipe calling for almonds would provide the perfect disguise for adding bitter almond essence. And I think that someone experimented with the proportions to determine exactly how much would be needed." Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. "The note about too much bitter suggests an earlier attempt that failed because the taste was too obvious. But how did she get the poison into the actual pudding?" "Mrs. Harrow prepared it herself in her own kitchen." "Did she?" Miss Marple raised her eyebrows slightly. "Or did she receive a parcel that morning, unwrap it in private, and then later send something to Mrs. Ray's house? What if the pudding Mrs. Harrow carried to the parish hall was not the one she had spent the previous evening preparing?" Dr. Haddock stared at her. "A substitution." "Precisely. Mrs. Ray could have prepared a poisoned pudding using the same recipe, wrapped it carefully, and delivered it the morning of the luncheon. Mrs. Harrow, thinking it a gift, or perhaps a peace offering, might have been curious enough to taste it, and finding it excellent, might have decided to serve it instead of her own. But surely she would have questioned such a gift. Perhaps. Or perhaps the note accompanying it was worded in such a way as to make the substitution seem reasonable. A suggestion that Mrs. Ray had made the same recipe and wanted Mrs. Harrow to taste it first, to settle their quarrel over who was the better cook. Miss Marple set down her knitting. Pride is a powerful force, Doctor. Mrs. Harrow's pride in her cooking might have been exactly what Mrs. Ray counted on. Dr. Haddock rose and paced to the window. It's diabolically clever, but can we prove any of it? I think we might, Miss Marple said. If we can find evidence that Mrs. Ray baked something that morning. Dora mentioned the parcel smelled of cinnamon, which is not an ingredient in the rosewater pudding recipe, but it might have been used to disguise another scent, something sharper and more bitter. The good smell of bitter almonds, Dr. Haddock said slowly. Exactly so. Outside, the autumn evening was drawing in, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Miss Marple sat in her comfortable chair and thought about jealousy and pride, about careful plans and careless mistakes. Mrs. Ray had been clever, but not quite clever enough. Like so many murderers, she had forgotten that small details matter, that servants notice things, and that altered recipes, like altered alibis, rarely held together under close examination. The curse had been a useful fiction, but the truth, as always, was far more mundane and far more deadly. Chapter 7. The oven, left burning, the inquest into Mrs. Harrow's death was held on a gray Thursday morning at the parish hall, the same room where she had collapsed 5 days earlier. Miss Marple attended, sitting quietly in the back row with her knitting bag, observing the proceedings with her usual attentive silence. Inspector Slack presented the findings with barely concealed frustration. The pudding had contained alethol dose of cyanide in the form of bitter almond essence. Mr. Alfred Harrow had been questioned extensively but released due to insufficient evidence. The source of the poison remained unknown, though it was noted that Mr. Harrow kept various garden chemicals in his shed. When Mrs. Ray was called to give evidence, she appeared calm and composed in her black dress, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Mrs. Ray, the coroner began, you donated the cookbook to the charity auction. Can you tell us when you last saw it after that event? I never saw it again, Mrs. Ray replied clearly. Once it was sold to Mrs. Harrow, it was no longer my concern. And you had no further contact with Mrs. Harrow regarding the cookbook or any recipes from it? None whatsoever. Mrs. Harrow and I were not on friendly terms. Inspector Slack leaned forward. You quarreled with the deceased over a recipe, did you not? We had a disagreement several months ago, yes, but I assure you I bore Mrs. Harrow no ill will. Her voice was steady, almost detached. I was not pleased about the stolen recipe, but such things happen in village life. One learns to overlook small slights. The coroner seemed satisfied, but Miss Marple noticed something curious. When Mrs. Ray spoke of overlooking small slights, her right hand had clenched briefly, the knuckles whitening, before she forced herself to relax. It was then that young Dora was called to testify. The girl was clearly terrified, her voice barely audible as she described the events of the days leading up to the tragedy. Miss Bennet? Inspector Slack said with exaggerated patience. You mentioned to Dr. Haddock that you delivered a parcel to Mrs. Ray's house on the morning of the luncheon. Can you describe this parcel? It was wrapped in brown paper, sir, about so big. She gestured with her hands. Heavy, like it had something solid inside, and it smelled of spices. Did Mrs. Harrow tell you what was in it? No, sir. She just said to take it to Mrs. Ray's house and leave it on the doorstep if no one answered. Mrs. Ray's composure flickered for just an instant. I received no such parcel, she said quickly, but Dora, emboldened by having her testimony taken seriously, continued, I left it just where Mrs. Harrow told me, ma'am, on the back doorstep by the kitchen door. The inquest concluded with an open verdict, the coroner noting that while Mrs. Harrow had clearly died of cyanide poisoning, the manner in which the poison entered the pudding remained unclear. It was unsatisfactory, but there was insufficient evidence to declare it murder or to name a suspect. As the room emptied, Miss Marple approached Dr. Haddock quietly. "I think," she said in a low voice, "that it might be time to visit Mrs. Ray's kitchen." Dr. Haddock looked startled. "On what pretext?" "Leave that to me, doctor. But I believe we should go this afternoon, before she has time to reflect too deeply on what young Dora said." That afternoon, Miss Marple presented herself at Mrs. Ray's cottage with Dr. Haddock in tow, claiming concern about the widow's health after the strain of the inquest. Mrs. Ray seemed reluctant to admit them, but the proprieties demanded it. She led them into her sitting room, her movements stiff and controlled. "I assure you I am perfectly well," she said. "The inquest was unpleasant, but I have weathered worse." Nevertheless, Miss Marple said gently, "Such events take a toll. Dr. Haddock was kind enough to accompany me. I wondered if you might have some tea. I find it settles the nerves wonderfully." There was a moment of hesitation. Then Mrs. Ray rose. "I'll put the kettle on." "Let me help you, dear," Miss Marple said, following before Mrs. Ray could object. "I know my way around a kitchen." The kitchen was as meticulously maintained as the garden, every surface gleaming, but as Miss Marple's sharp eyes traveled around the room, she noticed something unexpected. The oven was warm. She moved closer, as if admiring the modern range, and placed her hand near the door. Heat radiated from it distinctly, though no cooking smells filled the air. "What a lovely oven," she remarked. "You must do a great deal of baking." "Not today," Mrs. Ray said quickly. "I haven't had the heart for cooking since the tragedy." "How strange," Miss Marple said mildly. "It seems quite warm." Mrs. Ray's face tightened. "I may have turned it on this morning by mistake. I haven't been sleeping well." While Mrs. Ray busied herself with the tea things, Miss Marple glanced into the oven itself. A thin layer of ash coated the bottom, gray and fine. And there, barely visible in the back corner, was a fragment of paper, charred, but not completely destroyed. When Mrs. Ray turned to fetch the milk, Miss Marple carefully retrieved the fragment with her handkerchief. The paper was old, yellowed, with a few words still visible in faded ink. "Danger lies not in the food." "Miss Marple?" Dr. Haddock's voice came from the doorway. He had seen what she was doing and was providing cover. "Mrs. Ray was just telling me about her collection of antique kitchen implements." "Most fascinating." They took their tea in the sitting room, Mrs. Ray's hand trembling slightly as she poured. Miss Marple tucked the paper fragment carefully into her knitting bag. "Tell me, Mrs. Ray," Miss Marple said conversationally, "that parcel young Dora mentioned at the inquest, are you quite certain you never received it?" "Quite certain." But Mrs. Ray's teacup rattled against the saucer as she set it down. "How curious." The girl seemed very definite about delivering it. "Perhaps someone took it before I found it. One hears of such things." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed. She sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Though it does seem odd that someone would steal a parcel from your doorstep on the very morning that Mrs. Harrow was poisoned." The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. Mrs. Ray's face had gone pale, and her eyes darted between her two visitors. "I think," she said finally, her voice strained, "that you should both leave. I'm not feeling well after all." As they walked back through the village, Dr. Haddock examined the paper fragment Miss Marple had retrieved. "This is from the cookbook," he said with certainty. "The flyleaf, I'd wager. Someone burned it in that oven." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "And recently, too." The oven was still warm, though Mrs. Ray claimed she hadn't been cooking. "But why burn the flyleaf?" "Because," Miss Marple said quietly, "it contained something incriminating, a warning perhaps, or an inscription that might have revealed too much about the book's history. Something that might have led someone to question Mrs. Ray's story about donating it due to superstitious fears." Dr. Haddock looked troubled. We have fragments and suspicions, Miss Marple, but nothing conclusive. Nothing that would stand up in court. Not yet, Miss Marple agreed. But we are getting closer, Doctor. Much closer indeed. She thought of the warm oven, the ash, the fragment of warning written in faded ink. Mrs. Ray was covering her tracks, but she was doing so clumsily, in panic, rather than with the careful planning that had characterized the murder itself. It was a mistake, and like all mistakes, it would eventually lead to the truth. Chapter 8. The Gift Wrapped in Lace Mist. Marple had long believed that confronting a murderer required both courage and compassion. The courage to face unpleasant truths and the compassion to understand that even the worst actions sprang from recognizably human impulses. It was with this dual purpose that she invited Mrs. Ray to tea 2 days after their visit to the widow's cottage. The invitation was accepted, though Miss Marple suspected this owed more to curiosity than to any social inclination. Mrs. Ray arrived punctually at 4 o'clock, dressed with her usual precision in a dark gray dress, her face carefully composed. "How kind of you to invite me." "Miss Marple," she said, settling into the chair by the window. "I confess I've been rather isolated since the tragedy. People seem uncertain how to behave around me." "That's often the case when unpleasant events touch our lives," Miss Marple replied, pouring tea with a steady hand. "We become associated with tragedy, even when we bear no responsibility for it." Something flickered in Mrs. Ray's eyes, too quick to identify. They spoke of inconsequential matters for several minutes, the weather, and the state of the church roof, and Mrs. Bantry's planned visit to her daughter in Kent. Miss Marple was in no hurry. She had learned that patience was often more effective than directness. Finally, when the tea had been poured and the first cup nearly finished, Miss Marple set down her needlework and looked directly at her guest. "Mrs. Ray, I wonder if you might help me understand something that's been puzzling me." "If I can," Mrs. Ray said wearily. "Young Dora testified at the inquest that she delivered a parcel to your house on the morning of the luncheon, a parcel that smelled of spices and was about the size of a pudding basin. As I said at the inquest, I received no such parcel." "Yes, but you see, that creates a rather interesting problem." Miss Marple's tone remained gentle, almost conversational. "Because if Dora delivered the parcel as instructed and you did not receive it, then someone else must have taken it from your doorstep, which seems rather unlikely, don't you think? Who would steal a parcel of baked goods?" Mrs. Ray's cup rattled slightly. Perhaps the girl was confused about where she delivered it. "Dora is quite certain. She left it by your kitchen door, just as Mrs. Harrow instructed." Miss Marple paused, which raises another question. Why would Mrs. Harrow send you something on the very morning she was to serve her own pudding at the luncheon? "I'm sure I don't know." "I think you do know." "Mrs. Ray, I think Mrs. Harrow was returning something to you, something you had sent to her earlier that morning." The silence stretched between them. Mrs. Ray's face had gone quite pale, but her posture remained rigid. Miss Marple continued in the same gentle tone. "You see, I believe you sent Mrs. Harrow a pudding that morning, a pudding made from the same recipe she planned to use, but one you had prepared yourself. And I think you included a note suggesting she taste yours first, to settle your disagreement about who was the better cook." "That's absurd," Mrs. Ray said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Is it? You had the cookbook for months before donating it, long enough to study every recipe, to make notes in the margins about adjusting measurements, long enough to plan very carefully indeed." Miss Marple reached into her knitting bag and produced the torn page with its modern annotations. "This is your handwriting, isn't it? Half teaspoon only. Too much bitter. You were experimenting with how much bitter almond essence to add without making the taste obvious." Mrs. Ray stared at the page, her breathing shallow. "You sent Mrs. Harrow a poisoned pudding wrapped carefully to look like a peace offering or perhaps a challenge you knew her pride would compel her to taste it, to compare it with her own, and you knew that if she found it superior, she might even serve it instead of the one she had prepared. "You can't prove any of this," Mrs. Ray whispered. "Perhaps not in a court of law. Not yet." Miss Marple folded the page carefully. "But I found ash in your oven, Mrs. Ray. Ash from burning paper, and a fragment of the cookbook's flyleaf with a warning written in faded ink. You destroyed it because you feared it might reveal something about your true intentions for donating the cookbook." Mrs. Ray's hands gripped the arms of her chair. "She stole from me. She took my recipe, my work, and claimed it as her own. She won prizes that should have been mine. So you decided to punish her. I decided to show her that I was the better cook." The words burst out with sudden vehemence. "I wanted her to taste my pudding and know, finally, that I had surpassed her, that she could never match my skill. And the poison," Mrs. Ray's face crumpled slightly. "I only meant to make her ill, just ill enough to miss the luncheon, to lose face in front of everyone. The cookbook was perfect for my purpose. Everyone would blame the curse, and I would be free of suspicion because I had donated it." "But you used too much," Miss Marple said softly. "I didn't mean to kill her," Mrs. Ray's voice broke. "I tested the proportions carefully. But I must have miscalculated, or perhaps she ate more than I expected. I thought a small bite would merely sicken her, make her violently ill. Yet you knew cyanide was deadly. I thought I could control it." Mrs. Ray looked up, her eyes desperate. "You must understand, Miss Marple. She took everything from me, my recipes, my reputation as the finest cook in the village. She made me look like a fool, a bitter old woman who couldn't accept defeat. So you ensured she would never defeat you again." Mrs. Ray buried her face in her hands. "When I heard she'd collapsed, I knew immediately what had happened. I should have felt triumph, but all I felt was horror and fear." She looked up, tears streaking her cheeks. "I burned the flyleaf because it contained Lady Greaves's warning. It didn't mention a curse at all. It warned that the danger lay not in the recipes themselves, but in the one who prepared them with malice. I couldn't let anyone see that." Miss Marple sat quietly, letting the confession settle between them. Outside, the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, and somewhere in the garden a thrush sang its evening song. "What you did was born of jealousy and wounded pride," Miss Marple said finally. "Those are understandable feelings, Mrs. Ray. But murder is never the answer to hurt feelings, no matter how justified they seem." "What will you do?" Mrs. Ray asked, her voice small. "I will tell Dr. Haddock what you've told me, and he will inform Inspector Slack. What happens after that is in the hands of the law." Miss Marple's expression was kind but firm. "But I think you knew when you accepted my invitation today that this conversation was inevitable. Secrets have a way of becoming too heavy to carry alone." Mrs. Ray nodded slowly, almost with relief. "I haven't slept properly since it happened. Every time I close my eyes, I see her falling, hear the sound of that plate shattering." "Guilt is its own punishment," Miss Marple said gently. "But confession may bring you some measure of peace." When Dr. Haddock arrived an hour later with Inspector Slack, Mrs. Ray repeated her confession with the same weary resignation. She was taken away quietly through the back lane, her rigid composure finally broken. Miss Marple watched from her window as the car disappeared down the road, carrying with it the resolution of a tragedy that had begun with stolen recipes and wounded pride. Jealousy, she reflected, truly had spoiled more puddings than salt ever could. Chapter 9. The Truth Between the Recipes. The news of Mrs. Ray's arrest spread through St. Mary Mead with the speed characteristic of village gossip. By the following morning, Every household knew that the widow had confessed to poisoning Millicent Harrow, and opinions were divided between those who had always suspected something amiss and those who claimed complete astonishment. Miss Marple received a steady stream of visitors that day, each eager to discuss the shocking revelation. She fielded their questions with her usual patience, neither confirming nor denying the various theories that were already beginning to circulate. It was Mrs. Bantry who arrived mid-morning with the most pressing question. "But, Miss Marple, how did you know?" she demanded, settling into her customary chair. Everyone was so certain it must have been Alfred Harrow, or else some terrible accident. Even Inspector Slack seemed convinced the husband was guilty. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and smiled gently. "I didn't know at first, of course, but there were small things that didn't quite fit, like pieces from different puzzles being forced together." "What sort of things?" "Well, to begin with, the curse itself seemed rather too convenient. When something appears designed to misdirect attention, I find it's wise to look elsewhere." Miss Marple paused to pour fresh tea. Mrs. Ray donated the cookbook, claiming she feared its curse, but she'd kept it for months without apparent concern. Why suddenly develop superstitious fears? To establish a reason for giving it away, Mrs. Bantry guessed. Precisely, and to ensure that when tragedy struck, people would blame supernatural forces rather than human agency. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. Then there was the matter of the recipe theft. Mrs. Ray's anger was still quite fresh, despite months having passed. She spoke of it as though the wound had never healed. Mrs. Bantry nodded slowly. "I suppose people do hold grudges over the strangest things." "Indeed, they do, and in a village where one's reputation matters greatly, being bested repeatedly by the same person can become intolerable." Miss Marple's expression grew more serious. Mrs. Ray saw herself as the superior cook, the true artist. To have Millicent Harrow not only defeat her but allegedly steal her recipes was more than wounded pride. It was a fundamental attack on her sense of self. But to kill someone over baking competitions, it wasn't really about baking, my dear. It was about being seen, being valued, being acknowledged as superior. Mrs. Ray had built her entire identity around her culinary skills. When that was threatened, she couldn't bear it. Mrs. Bantry shuddered slightly. "How did you work out about the switched puddings?" "Young Dora was instrumental there. She mentioned the mysterious parcel that arrived the morning of the luncheon, and the fact that Mrs. Harrow sent her to deliver something to Mrs. Ray's house shortly afterward." Miss Marple sipped her tea. It seemed odd that two women who weren't speaking would exchange parcels, unless, of course, one was returning what the other had sent. "You think Mrs. Harrow realized the pudding was from Mrs. Ray?" "I think she may have suspected it after tasting it. The note Mrs. Ray sent probably claimed she wanted to prove she could make the same recipe better. Mrs. Harrow, being proud, would naturally taste it to compare." Miss Marple's face softened with sadness. Her last act was to send it back, perhaps intending to confront Mrs. Ray later, but she had already consumed enough poison for it to be fatal. "How dreadful," Mrs. Bantry murmured. "What sealed my suspicions was the ash in Mrs. Ray's oven. She had burned something recently, despite claiming she hadn't been cooking. The fragment I found contained part of Lady Greaves's warning, which mentioned nothing about curses but spoke, instead of danger lying with the one who serves the food." Miss Marple set down her cup. Mrs. Ray had to destroy it because it contradicted her entire story about the Cursed Cookbook. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching the autumn leaves drift past the window. "There's one thing I still don't understand," Mrs. Bantry said finally. "Mrs. Ray confessed that she only meant to make Millicent ill, not kill her. Do you believe that?" Miss Marple considered this carefully. "I believe she told herself that, yes. It's quite common for people to minimize their intentions, even to themselves. But cyanide is a deadly poison, and Mrs. Ray was an intelligent woman who had experimented with the proportions. The notes in the cookbook margin showed she had tested different amounts, so she knew it could be fatal. I think some part of her knew, even if she refused to acknowledge it consciously. She wanted Millicent Harrow humiliated, defeated, removed from competition. Death accomplished all of those aims quite thoroughly. Miss Marple's tone was gentle but firm. We often lie to ourselves about our darkest impulses, my dear. It makes them easier to live with. Mrs. Bantry looked troubled. It's all rather sad, really. 2 women destroyed over something as trivial as baking. It wasn't trivial to them, Miss Marple pointed out. In a village like ours, where opportunities for distinction are limited, such competitions take on enormous significance. For Mrs. Ray especially, who had no family and few close friends, her reputation as an accomplished cook was everything. Later that afternoon, Dr. Haddock called to inform Miss Marple that Alfred Harrow had been completely exonerated and had expressed his gratitude for her efforts in uncovering the truth. Poor man, Miss Marple said. He was grieving his wife while under suspicion of murdering her. How is he managing? As well as can be expected. He's selling the house and moving to be near his sister in Devon. He says he can't bear to stay in St. Mary Mead with all the memories. Dr. Haddock settled into his chair with a sigh. Inspector Slack is taking full credit for solving the case. Naturally, Miss Marple smiled. That's quite all right, Doctor. I have no need for recognition. I'm simply glad the truth came out before an innocent man was condemned. Mrs. Ray's solicitor says she'll plead guilty. She doesn't want Atrial. He shook his head. She claims she never meant to kill anyone, that it was all a terrible miscalculation. Perhaps she believes that now. Human memory is remarkably skilled at revising our past intentions to make them more palatable. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking steadily. But whatever she intended, the result was murder, and she must face the consequences of that. You're very philosophical about it. I've lived long enough to see that most evil springs from ordinary human failings. Doctor, pride, envy, wounded vanity. Mrs. Ray isn't a monster. She's simply a woman who let her grievances consume her until they poison not just a pudding, but her entire soul. Dr. Haddock departed shortly afterward, and Miss Marple was left alone with her thoughts and her knitting. Outside, the village went about its business, already beginning to incorporate this new scandal into its collective memory. She thought of Mrs. Ray, who would spend the rest of her life paying for one terrible decision born of jealousy and pride. She thought of Millicent Harrow, whose own pride had led her to taste a pudding that killed her. And she thought of poor Alfred Harrow, whose life had been shattered by forces he could never have anticipated. It was, Miss Marple reflected, a tragedy born entirely of human nature. No curse, no supernatural force, just the ordinary darkness that lurks in ordinary hearts when wounded pride meets patient hatred. She picked up her knitting once more, finding comfort in the steady rhythm of the needles, in the creation of something useful and warm from simple wool. Some things, at least, were uncomplicated. Chapter 10. The Curse Lifted. 3 weeks had passed since Mrs. Ray's arrest, and autumn had deepened into the first hints of winter. The leaves had fallen from the trees in the churchyard, and a chill wind swept through St. Mary Mead, bringing with it the sense that one chapter had closed and another was beginning. Miss Marple stood in the parish hall supervising the arrangement of tables for the special charity event the vicar had organized. It was, he had explained, a way for the village to reclaim the space from the shadow of tragedy and to raise additional funds for the church roof, which remained in a precarious state. I do think it's the right thing to do, Mrs. Clement said, arranging flowers on the main table. We can't let one terrible event taint this hall forever. It's been the center of village life for generations. Quite right, Miss Marple agreed. She was knitting a scarf for the charity table, her needles moving with practice. Ease. Life must continue, and dwelling on darkness only gives it more power, the charity. Table itself was laden with the usual assortment of donated items, preserves, and handicrafts, books and bric-a-brac, and there, placed with careful ceremony, was the cookbook that had caused such tragedy. The vicar had decided, after much consideration, that it should be returned to the charity collection, but this time it had been placed in a glass case with a small card explaining its historical significance. It would be sold as a collector's item, with the understanding that it belonged in a museum or archive rather than a working kitchen. "Do you think anyone will bid on it?" Mrs. Bantry asked, joining Miss Marple by the table. "I imagine someone will," Miss Marple replied, "though perhaps not from our village. There are collectors who value such things for their historical interest rather than their practical use. It seems rather morbid, selling something connected to a murder." "The book itself is innocent," Miss Marple observed gently. "It's merely paper and ink, recipes copied down long ago by someone who never imagined the use to which it would be put." The evil was entirely human. Mrs. Bantry shivered slightly. "I still can't quite believe Elizabeth Ray did such a thing. She always seemed so proper, so controlled. That was rather the problem, I think. Too much control, too much propriety, with no outlet for the feelings simmering beneath." Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. "When such feelings finally break free, they often do so with terrible force." The hall began to fill with villagers, many of whom had come as much to satisfy their curiosity as to support the church. The murder had been the most exciting event in St. Mary Mead for years, and people were still processing the shock of it all. Colonel Melchett arrived with his wife, both looking rather more subdued than usual. They had been particularly vocal in their certainty that Alfred Harrow must be guilty, and the revelation of their error had chastened them considerably. "Miss Marple," Colonel Melchett said, approaching her with uncharacteristic humility, "I wanted to thank you for getting to the truth of the matter. I'm afraid I was rather quick to judge poor Harrow." "We all form hasty conclusions at times," Miss Marple said kindly. "The important thing is to remain open to evidence that contradicts our initial assumptions." Dr. Haddock had positioned himself near the refreshment table and waved Miss Marple over when he caught her eye. "I had a letter from Alfred Harrow this morning," he said quietly. "He's settled in Devon and says he's beginning to find some peace. He wanted me to convey his gratitude to you specifically." "How kind of him." "I'm glad he's able to start rebuilding his life. He mentioned something interesting. He said that Millicent had tasted the pudding that morning and declared it excellent, better even than her own attempt. She'd been quite excited about serving it." Dr. Haddock's expression was somber. "She never suspected it was poisoned. She died thinking she was about to triumph." Miss Marple was silent for a moment, her bright eyes sad. "That's the cruelest part of it all. Mrs. Ray wanted Millicent to know she'd been defeated, but Millicent died believing she was about to present something wonderful. The intended humiliation never even occurred. Do you think Mrs. Ray realizes that?" "I expect she does now, and I suspect it haunts her. She committed murder, and yet she didn't achieve what she most wanted, which was to see Millicent acknowledge her superiority." The vicar called for attention, and the room gradually quieted. He spoke briefly about the importance of community, of supporting one another through difficult times, and of moving forward while remembering the lessons of the past. "We must not let tragedy define us," he concluded, "but neither should we forget the dangers of letting our grievances fester into something darker. Let us instead choose forgiveness, understanding, and compassion." It was a good speech, Miss Marple thought, though perhaps a bit optimistic about human nature. Still, optimism had its place, even if realism suggested that villages would always have their jealousies and small cruelties. As the afternoon wore on and various items were sold or claimed, Miss Marple found herself standing before the glass case containing the cookbook. A gentleman from London, a dealer in antiquarian books, had expressed interest in purchasing it for a collector who specialized in 18th century domesticitums. It's a genuine piece of history, the dealer was explaining to the vicar. The association with recent events is unfortunate, but it doesn't diminish the book's historical value. My client will preserve it properly. I'm glad it will be cared for, Vicar said, though I confess I'll be relieved to see it leave St. Mary Mead. The transaction was completed, and the cookbook was carefully wrapped and removed from the hall. Miss Marple watched it go with mixed feelings. It was, as she had said, merely an object, innocent of any wrongdoing, but it had been the instrument around which so much pain had revolved. Later, as the crowd thinned and the tables were being cleared, Mrs. Bantry joined Miss Marple for a final cup of tea. "Well," Mrs. Bantry said, with satisfaction, "I think we can call this a successful afternoon. The roof fund has been substantially increased, and the village seems ready to move past the whole dreadful business." "Villages are remarkably resilient," Miss Marple agreed. "Give it a few months, and this will be just another story people tell, like the tale of the Cursed Cookbook itself. The details will blur, the emotions will fade, and it will become simply part of local history." "You sound almost wistful about that." "Not wistful precisely, but I think it's important to remember that behind every story of a curse or a tragedy, there are real people with real feelings. Mrs. Ray wasn't evil incarnate. She was a lonely, proud woman who made a terrible choice because she couldn't bear her own sense of inadequacy." Mrs. Bantry considered this. "You're very charitable toward her." "I'm realistic about her," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Charity would be pretending she didn't do something dreadful. Realism is acknowledging that any of us, given the right combination of grievance and opportunity, might make choices we later regret." They finished their tea in comfortable silence, watching the last of the villagers depart into the gathering dusk. The parish hall would soon be empty again, ready to host the next village event, the next gathering of St. Mary Mead's residents. As Miss Marple gathered her knitting bag and prepared to leave, she paused to look around the room one final time. So much had happened here in the past few weeks. A woman had died. Another had been arrested for murder. And a village had confronted the uncomfortable truth that darkness could exist even in the most seemingly ordinary hearts. "There's no such thing as a cursed book." "My dear," she said to Mrs. Bantry as they walked out into the cool evening air. "Only cursed intentions." Mrs. Bantry linked her arm through Miss Marple's. "I suppose you're right, though I must say I'm rather glad that particular book is gone. Even knowing it wasn't truly cursed, I wouldn't have wanted it in my kitchen." Miss Marple smiled. "I quite understand. Still, I think I'll stick to knitting." "One can't lace yarn with cyanide," Mrs. Bantry laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet village square. It was a genuine laugh, free of the tension that had gripped St. Mary Mead for weeks. And as they walked together toward their respective homes, Miss Marple felt the satisfaction of knowing that while she couldn't prevent human nature from asserting itself in dark ways, she could at least ensure that truth eventually emerged from shadow. The village of St. Mary Mead returned to its peaceful rhythm, as villages always do. The shops closed for the evening. Lights appeared in cottage windows, and the church bell told the hour with its familiar, reassuring sound. Life, Miss Marple reflected, always found a way to continue, and in that continuation lay both hope and caution, for human nature remained forever the same, capable of great kindness and terrible cruelty, often existing side by side in the same heart. She reached her gate and paused to look back at the village she had observed for so many years. Tomorrow there would be new small dramas, new tensions and reconciliations, new mysteries to untangle. But tonight, at least, St. Mary Mead was at peace.